You're ready, sweetheart.
Okay, I just started the recording. I want to welcome everyone today to the Beyond Black History Month program, and I'd like to turn it over to Gene Crump so he can introduce our speakers. It's best if you put your computer on mute so that any background noise where you are doesn't pop in. David, I see you're there. If you want to add anything, you can. He's our president of ASALH. Thank you.
Just to welcome everybody, and it's always good to see you for another exciting edition of our Beyond Black History Month. And so happy that Gene and Linda and the Education Committee have continued to do such a great job. So take it away, Gene.
Thank you, David. I'd like to thank the Education Committee for all their work in putting these programs on for the benefit of ASALH and the invited guests. And this month's program is History, Art, and the First Lincoln Memorial. And it'll be brought to us by Mike Weddle and Marcia E. Coles. And
No S.
Pardon me?
No S on Cole.
Marcia Cole.
Yes.
I'd like to give you some information about Mike and Marcia. Mike is a physician and a wellness director at Multicultural Health Institute. His introduction to Washington monuments came after meeting his wife-to-be while living there and meeting up for morning runs together in the city of monuments. Marcia E. Cole is an educator, a playwright, a poet, and a Civil War reenactor with Freed, Female Reenactors of Distinction, associated with the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. Her programming includes Going for Freedom, true accounts of flight told in verse, stories of the UGGR, that's the Underground Railroad, and a double take on lynching, two compelling voices with historian Susan Strasser. She has penned two poetry collections, Light in Dark Places, History in Verse, and Behold a Hall of Light, History in Verse, which have been, pardon me?
It's a ball of light.
Ball of Light, which has been the subject of radio interviews and requested readings. A third is on the way. And her two poetry collections have been donated to the Betty Jean Johnson Library, the African American Cultural Resource Center, and they're there for anybody to check out and read them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike to begin the program, History, Art, and the First Lincoln Memorial.
Thank you, Gene. So the First Lincoln Memorial is more commonly today called the Emancipation Monument. It sits in Lincoln Park on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Some of you know this story. Some of you, I'm sure know parts of this story. Since this is about visual art, I'm going to start by showing some pictures so that we're all on the same page in terms of the images, okay, since this is about art. And then in just a little bit, I'll introduce our special guest coming to us from Washington, D.C., Marcia Cole, who Gene just told you about. So let me do a screen share. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is about art and historical art, especially historical public art, of course, can be political. And like any visual art, and in that, matter of fact, like history in general, it is open to interpretation, and your interpretation depends on your perspective. So we're going to look at some images. Consider the Lincoln Memorial that we know on the Washington Mall. We all have an image of it in our minds. For many of us, that image includes Dr. King reading a speech during the March on Washington. And then what happened after Mahalia Jackson came up behind Dr. King and said, "Martin, tell him about your dream." And the rest is history. That's our image of the Lincoln Memorial for many people. But that memorial was built at the end of World War I, and the perspective then was very different. The Lincoln Memorial was meant to be a colossus. It symbolized how white America saw itself. Giants, the saviors of the world after the war to end all wars. And at that time, I think it was dedicated in 1922, white America was going to be the leaders of a new world order. Well, we know how that turned out. Today, we're discussing another Lincoln Memorial, now called the Emancipation Monument, also in Washington, D.C. Here is the monument, and here is Marcia Cole, poet, playwright, and historical reenactor at the monument. This first Emancipation Monument was created in the 1870s. It was paid for 100% by Black Americans. On her website, Marcia writes, "The artist's job is to get under the facts and tell the truths." And you know, that actually got me thinking that a statue made of stone and metal is a solid thing, like a fact. But like any fact, a piece of art needs interpreted to find its truth. There's been controversy about this statue, including controversy in the Black community, and about whether the monument should be removed or should be kept in its place. Marcia has been a proponent of preservation. Here we see Marcia in the role of Charlotte Scott, the woman whose idea it was to create the statue. She was the creative spark, and she donated the first $5 towards its building. Charlotte Scott was a former slave who lived in Ohio. Marcia can tell you much more about Charlotte Scott than I can. But when she heard about the assassination of President Lincoln, she had the idea that there should be a monument, there should be a memorial to Lincoln. And she contributed the first $5 towards its building. Some of the other characters in this story: the first $5 from Miss Scott made it into the hands of Unitarian minister William Elliott, seen here on the right. Elliott was able eventually to raise $18,000 from Black soldiers and former slaves for the building of a monument. On the left, we see a man named Archer Alexander. He was an escaped slave who had delivered information to Union troops from behind enemy lines. He couldn't go back home. Essentially, he would be accused of being a spy. And so he was given a temporary work permit to stay in St. Louis, and he took refuge with abolitionist William Elliott. William Elliott. Archer Alexander was a distant grandfather of Muhammad Ali. Elliott was the grandfather of T.S. Eliot. Elliott also founded Washington University in St. Louis. Now, William Elliott was on vacation. He was traveling in Italy, and he saw the statue on the left. It was made by a sculptor living in Italy from Boston named Thomas Ball. Now, Ball had made the statue of Lincoln with a Black man, and Elliott knew that $18,000 would not pay for a grand, giant monument. And so he asked Ball if Ball would make another statue for the Lincoln Memorial, which became the Emancipation Monument, with modifications. Elliott asked for some modifications. One of those modifications we can see here. On the left, the man with Lincoln is crouching. He's clearly kneeling. On the right, the figure has his right dominant arm outstretched. That's a counterbalancing maneuver. What it indicates in a sculpture which is not moving is that movement is occurring. It's a gesture of standing up or rising up. When you rise up, you put your arm out to sort of counterbalance your weight so you don't lose your balance when you stand. So this is a man intended to be in the action of standing up. Now, from this perspective view, you can see that the Black man, who you now may recognize as Arthur Alexander, he had Alexander be the model for this second statue. He is holding his chains in his fist, in the fist of his dominant hand. And that was supposed to represent that it was Arthur Alexander. It was the crouching, rising figure who was in the act of breaking his own chains. There's a story that was told about Lincoln in the newspapers a few days before Lee surrendered at Appomattox. It may not be a true story. It may be one of those, Washington and the cherry tree type stories that are made up, but there's a chance that it might have influenced Thomas Ball in the statue that he created. And briefly, the story went like this. Lincoln arrived in Richmond, Virginia. A Black man working there at the docks recognized him, and the story goes that the man screamed, "Glory to God." And as Lincoln walked through the town, the story describes a scene like Jesus entering Jerusalem. A crowd of 1,000 are following him, yelling Messiah and Hallelujah. And then as the story goes, one man falls on his knees in front of Lincoln. Lincoln becomes angry. He raises his arm and he admonishes the man, "Don't kneel to me, kneel only to God." That was the story that was in the paper. And you can sort of look at the statue and imagine maybe Thomas Ball had read or heard that story, which may have been a story made up for the paper. We don't know. This is a copy of the Emancipation Monument, dedicated a few years after the one in Washington in Boston, the hometown of Thomas Ball. This was erected in 1879. And Boston made a decision about what they wanted to do with the statue. They removed it. This was in 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd protests, and statues were being removed in different cities. And in Boston, the city citation called the statue prejudice and said, quote, "It obscured the role of Black Americans in shaping the nation's freedoms," unquote. Remember, the statue was a collaboration between Eliot and Ball, two white men. That was in Boston. At the dedication ceremony in Washington in 1876, recently liberated men and women were understandably and undeniably grateful for being freed. There didn't seem to be a lot of questioning of a system where only white men had the power to free people. They were grateful, I'm sure, to Lincoln, and that was expressed in this poem read at the dedication by the famous poet Henrietta Cordelia Ray, called "The Martyred Chief." It's a very long poem, but these are just two lines. "The applause of nations for thy soul sincere, a loving tribute we would offer here. 'Twas thine, not words, to conquer, but men's hearts, to change to balm the sting of slavery's darts." A poem of gratitude to the man Lincoln. Now, the keynote speaker that day was Frederick Douglass. And he said undeniably that Lincoln had hated slavery, that Frederick Douglass understood this, but the keynote address that he gave was a little different than the poem that was expressed. It was a little more layered. Even here in the presence of this monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. Douglass was always kind of ahead of his time. And he was ahead of his time in seeing white identity as a product of race culture, something we have trouble with even today. He put a short article in the paper after the statue had been dedicated and erected, And his newspaper article said that the Negro, referring to the character in the statue, the figure in the statue, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not on his knees, but erect on his feet like a man. What he was asking for was another statue or a plaque or some sort of contextualization of the statue that had been dedicated. And he didn't see that in his lifetime. So those are the images. Let me get out of screen share here. Good, okay. Can we get Marsha up? Okay, I should see both of us and I don't, I only see Marsha. There we go, perfect, thank you so much. So now I'm going to introduce Marsha Cole, who you've already heard about, poet, playwright, historical reenactor, civil rights activist, friend, and I'm honored to be her friend. Coming to us from Washington, D.C. Marsha, I'd like to start just by asking you about the monument itself. You know it much better than I do. And could you tell us about the monument and why you decided to invest yourself so much in this conversation about preserving it or not preserving it, that whole conversation going on surrounding this piece of art?
Well, I think I should start by saying how I got involved with the monument. And that came about by, I would say, being curious. I had taken a history course as an adult. And in the taking of that course, I realized how little I knew about Black history. And so I began to do more reading, and through the rigorous assignments that I got, writing assignments I got, I explored the various topics. And one of them was the topic of lynching. But then as I went further, I understood more about the Underground Railroad. DC is a wonderful place to explore and to learn more history because we have wonderful access to Smithsonian museums and galleries. And so I realized I could take myself to these places and learn and just explore and delve into things I didn't know. And I also went to nearby areas in Baltimore, and I went to an exhibit at the Maryland Historical Society and saw an exhibit by Fred Wilson called Mind the Museum. And it was there that I saw an artifact that fired my imagination. It was in state inventory, and that led me on a discovery of to writing a play, A Matter of Worth. And in that play, I also included poetry. I began to write poetry, and I made that a part of the play. And so I arced the story as an exploration of freedom, what it means to be free, and the desire for freedom. As I explored more stories of freedom, I began to write those stories as well in poetry, and developed a program I called Going for Freedom, True Accounts of Flight, History in Verse. And as I looked for more stories to tell, I came, and the internet's wonderful now. You have you can Google anything. And I came across reference to the monument. I said, well, my goodness, this is here in DC. Let me go see it. So when I went down there to Lincoln Park and saw the monument, my personal reaction was one of understanding. I understood what I was looking at. I was not offended because it said emancipation, and the shun on the word means something is taking place. So I understood in my mind that the figure was rising. So as I approached it and looked at this placard there, because I always read signage and things so that I don't just go and look at things. I read the signage as well because that's where the information is. And on that sign, on the front, the placard in front of a monument, it had two names on it, Charlotte Scott and Abraham Lincoln. And it said Charlotte Scott, a former slave, gave her first $5 from freedom towards him and made the suggestion to have this monument erected. I thought that was a compelling story and would make a good poem. So I filed away in my mind and went home. Well, after a while, because I was still exploring history, I learned that there was going to be a Civil War enthusiasts at Fort Stevens, which was not far from where I grew up. And I decided to go there and see what they were doing because I figured I might get some stories there. And while I was there, I met some ladies who were in period clothes, African-American women in period clothes. And I approached them and said, "What, why are you dressed this way?" And they told me what they do. And what they do is they recover the stories of people, of Black women in history who were free, who made a contribution, but whose stories got lost. And they recover those stories. And I thought that was really interesting. So I said, they invited me to come to their meeting. And I went to their meeting and I decided it was in alignment with where I was going as exploring history. And so they said, but you have to pick someone whose story you will tell. Well, I knew immediately whose story I would tell. It would be that of Charlotte Scott. Well, at the time, there wasn't a lot of information online about Charlotte Scott, but I did find one, I think it was a blog about that included her in it. And looking further in the article, it says something about Lynch's Ferry, a magazine. And I contacted the person who wrote the article, and she told me where she got the magazine. And I contacted them and got the copy, and it had a wealth of information on Charlotte Scott. So using that, I crafted a presentation on her life story to the best of my ability, enough to tell why she was important in history. So we do presentations when we're asked to do so. And it was wonderful. Well, in 2020, it really became important because with all the taking down of monuments, the people seized their eyes upon the Emancipation Monument as well. I said, oh, he's groveling at Lincoln's feet, he's shining his shoes, it's unmanly, and they want to take it down. Well, some people who also were interested in the monument decided we were going to go down and do a teach-in. Well, the take it downers heard about it and decided they were going to come down and disrupt what we were doing. So what to do? All these angry people. So I decided to take the megaphone and address the crowd. So I march up there in my outfit and I take the megaphone and say, this is an important artifact. You can't take this thing down. And I went on, I said, let me share this with you. And I had written a poem that I thought captured what the people may have been feeling and to help them see it differently. And it's called Commission. I will share that at the end. Well, whatever I said seemed to have calmed them down because as far as I know, the monument still stands. And it seems as though it's a matter of shame. And there's nothing to be ashamed about, and I express that. And they talk about, oh, well, even Fred Douglass himself, at one time, depending on when you asked him the question, said he didn't look manly and whatnot. And people wanted to say, well, why is he looking the way he's doing? Well, I have a very interesting fact that I just recently discovered. Once again, looking for more material to share in poetry, I came across the name of Philip Reed. I don't know if you've heard of him or not, but if you've seen the figure of freedom on the Capitol Dome, Philip Reed had something to do with its completion. Well, Philip Reed was a former slave. He was born in 1820, and he was bought by a gentleman in Bladensburg, Maryland. He had a mill, a foundry, and his name was, what's his name, Will? And so Philip learned, he was a very good student, observer, and he learned a lot about the foundry business, how to create these artifacts. And as time, if he was there for 2 decades, and the person who was, when they got the commission to do the monument for Lincoln, the person who was a designer of it, he was facing, it says, Mills quickly recognized that Reed was skilled in ironworking, including him as an essential part of his construction team. And in 1860, a salary dispute with a foreman who was scheduled to assemble the 5 main sections of the plaster mold led to his dismissal. So they were in a pickle, because what were they going to do with pieces of a monument? But Philip, who had been very mindful, thought he could figure out a way to put the pieces together. And he did. With the help of the others there, they managed to get together and to forge the monument. So by the time it was completed and put it on top of the Capitol Dome, he himself was free by the Compensated Emancipation Act. That was in 1862. So there we have it. So here's key. When the monument was installed in 1876, it was facing west and facing the Capitol. And as people have been saying, myself have been saying, it looked like the man was looking towards a life of freedom. He was literally looking at the freedom statue on top of the Capitol Dome. That's how they positioned it. And it was only in 1974 when they turned it around 180 degrees to so that Lincoln's back would not be to Mary McLeod Bethune, which was installed then, that they are facing each other. But the original positioning had the rising figure literally looking upward towards freedom, the monument of freedom on the Capitol Dome. And so that, I think that gives it more weight as to why it's important, because it was originally intended to show that he was looking towards a life of freedom. And many people don't know that. I didn't know that until fairly recently, when I sort of cobbled together some information. So wait a minute, you know, he was, that was the intent. So I think if people understood that, they might be more disposed to seeing that its significance is great. And I was saying, let it stand. That was my position. And I think that the former president of the Abraham Lincoln Association, Bob Willard, says it well when he says, history is best understood in the context of where of the place of where it occurred. And so that is where history installed it. And I think it should remain there. So people who, you know, you can't, everybody's not gonna like everything, but if you understand the importance of it, then that should give it validity to stay where it is. So I've been on the campaign to try and get signage for the monument so that people who look at it will understand what it's all about and why it should remain there. And that's been my position. And what was wonderful was that when I was approaching the crowd, it found its way in the news. And people who saw me, who want to work with me to protect it, approached me. And so we created a team that developed a website that I think is in the chat, emancipationmonument.org. So this team includes a lawyer. There are several authors, historians, genealogists, and myself. And we put together this website that gives a full explanation of what is there. One tab talks about the optics of the monument. People tend to only look at the front of it, facing it, but there's a lot of encoded information embedded in the monument around through symbols. There's a ball and chain that's broken. There's a pierced heart. And there's also a bundle of sticks of faces that suggest unity and strength and unity, and other things that go on there. So I was very, very delighted that they wanted to work with me on this. And I invite people to take a look at it. to see more of what is there.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, the other symbols in the statue that I didn't know about. I think you answered that. I must admit, my first response when I saw the statue was very, it wasn't very nuanced at all. It was like, that's just wrong, and learning these things really helped me to appreciate it through your perspective.
Well, that's the whole point, is to give people a chance to re-examine. One of the things that I have said in the past is that when people are there and they're feeling uncomfortable in the presence of the statue, it means that their beliefs are being challenged. They may go there with preconceived notions, but they don't really know the history behind it and all that is there. And we also explained, and you explained, that the rising figure is based on an actual person. So it's not just some generic person, but based on an actual person who had a part to play in the success of the Union soldiers, by making sure that they didn't get killed by crossing a bridge that had been compromised. So that was another factor in him gaining, Arthur Alexander, and gaining his freedom, because he helped in that way. So I want people to go there, to look at it, to learn, and to because if this is taken down, then it would, you can't erase the reality of history, and artifacts help us to recall things that we don't want to return to, but where we've come from. Now, just like we keep forts help us to realize, parts of history in the battles and battlefields. People like to keep the great houses, the plantations, as symbols of our history, but the uncomfortable things, they tend not to want to be a part of. So, I want them to know the whole story and to accept it as a symbol of how far we have come. And we no longer need to return to that kind of position. Anything else? And there's
Mike, you're muted.
You go ahead. I was talking, but I was muted, and maybe that was a good thing, because you were getting going again. I'm going to remute myself.
Well, there are a number of things that have taken place in that park. There was a Juneteenth ceremony that I participated in with Miss Opal, and it started at the monument and took a walk to Capitol Hill, and other historic events have taken place at that monument in that park. And so it has, if you take it away, then Miss Bethune will be there all by herself, and we don't want that to happen. Having them in connection with one another shows where we may have started in this country, but the realization of getting an education, which is what freedom is all about, being educated so that you can take advantage of what this country proposes to offer to us. Did you want to ask me something?
What I was asking was, yeah, I had written something down as you were talking, recording the stories of Black women. And I think your life as an artist is interesting, because you started as a poet and a playwright, writing roles for other people to perform, and then making that step to becoming a historical reenactor and creating those roles using your own voice, your own body, your own spoken word art, I think is a very interesting thing. Can you tell us about the historical reenacting and how you assume that role and how you bring life to Charlotte, or any other roles that you've done?
Well, thank you for that question. As I began to write my poetry for the Underground Railroad, I said, well, gee whiz, Marcia, surely you can recite your own poetry. So I gave myself permission to recite my own poetry. And then I gave myself permission to be even more involved with it by creating an outfit, or not costume, but to dress in a way that might have been appropriate for the period as a formerly enslaved woman. And that was very effective in my presentations, and I began to add sound effects. Well, when I decided to do Miss Charlotte, the ladies of Free were very generous, and they helped me get an outfit, and they fit me, and I wore it. And I said, how would I have felt? What might Miss Charlotte have felt in telling her story? And looking at her picture, she was a very dignified woman. And you can see that she looks, you might not think she'd ever been a slave, but that was one of the important things, that once the enslaved got their freedom, they wanted to have pictures of themselves as free persons. And so that meant not dressed, in tatters, but looking as fine as they could. So they might have to borrow something, a piece from someone, to get the entire look that they were after. And so that's what you can see when you look at Miss Charlotte. And I think she was a sweet person. She must have been resourceful. You can't come through what she came through without being resourceful. And I think she was a good worker and a trusted person. And because once her former owners heard her request to have this monument erected, they were willing to help her do that. And so that shows a level of regard for her as a person, a thinking person, a feeling person, to pursue that on her behalf. So that's what I just wanted her story to be told, because she, for me, symbolizes what one person can do. It always starts with one person. We are all one. And so we each can bring something, we each do bring something to the planet, and can bring something to contribute to mankind. And I think that's what she did with her life. By being generous of heart, she wasn't bitter, she wasn't vengeful, she was thankful, and she put her money where her mouth is. And because of her good actions, history remembers her as a friend of Lincoln, not because she actually knew him, but she acted as a friend would do, which is to lift up someone who has passed, and to hold them in regard, and to dignify their memory. So that's why I wanted to tell her story, and I try to tell it in a way that would bring her honor. And I want her story to continue to be told, so others will be inspired that they too can do great works, even as one person. And I like the line by Dr. Maya Angelou. She says, I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. So Miss Charlotte was indicative of many who maybe are not recorded like she has been, but who have done great things and made great strides. And she's among them.
I think it's really interesting that even when the statue was dedicated, there were these different points of view and expressed at the dedication by the poet and Frederick Douglass. How do I want to ask this? Can you discuss from your experience this intersection between art and truth, and how to contextualize these things? I know Frederick Douglass thought maybe another statue. Other people have put up plaques trying to explain the historical context of public art. Maybe the Park Service should have someone there to reenact or to explain. What is the best way, in your view, of contextualizing this so that people can appreciate the things that you're sharing with us?
Well, for one thing, I say again, it should stay where it is, because that's where it was put. If others want to put some other statues in there, that may be okay, but not beside it, because it wasn't installed there at the time, and to sort of take away from its importance. But that's really how I see it. I don't see why we need to conflate all these things. It certainly wouldn't be the same in a museum, and I would like to see it there where it has always been, as a reminder of what we've come from. Did that,
Yeah, thanks. I want to ask, and maybe there's not an answer to this, and we haven't, everyone thinks this is all scripted, but it's not. You were talking about the voices of Black women, recording their voices, reenacting their ideas, their contributions. I think you and I discussed a long time ago Nancy Green,
mhm,
and she was an activist. She was an activist against poverty, a civil rights activist. She was apparently a wonderful storyteller, a former slave. And her history was sort of erased because her trademark name became Aunt Jemima.
mhm.
And how do you honor the work of someone like that? Given, I mean, it's the same sort of thing where, you know, you look at the image in modern eyes and you sort of want to put it under the rug. What do you think?
Well, her story is very much worthy of being recovered. The truth of her story is worthy of being recovered. I liked Aunt Jemima pancakes when I was growing up, so the picture that I saw was not insulting in any way. And in fact, I treat the name Aunt Jemima in one of my poems. And the image has evolved over time, but she made somebody very wealthy by adopting her pancake recipe. And so there's no reason to be ashamed by her either. Her actual life was a worthy life. And it should be told, and not just the caricature on the box of pancake mix that people think somehow was actually her. It's just marketing. It was just all marketing. She was a real person, but that was marketing. And
I want to have plenty of time for your poem. But first, can you just, is there something, and maybe you've already expressed it, but is there something through the voice of Charlotte Scott that you would like to teach us?
just to be your best self, you can contribute, you follow your heart, your heart and your dictates. She did not know how this was going to play out, but she apparently was a very hopeful person. And she figured, it seems as though she figured if she held on, if she stayed the course of her life, that things would get better. And they did. And that's a lesson we all can take. Things can look pretty dim. But if you stay positive, go forward with your life, things can be better, and you can make a definite change in your life and the world.
Thank you. So I will remind everyone that, well, of course, Marsha's continuing to write, but she has 2 collections that have been published, and those will be available at the African American Cultural Resource Center at Betty Johnson Library. And you can also get them on Amazon, and they're available online. I'm going to mute myself again and let Marsha read, if you would, for us, please.
Okay. This is the poem that I recited when I was facing the very agitated crowd. And it's called Commissioned. I have been commissioned by the ancestors beyond the veil that hangs between the living and departed to speak to you. Their voices are restless. Do not forget their lessons. They see how you turn your head, avert your eyes when you chance upon images from those dark times. They sense the shame that beats within your breast to dissent from such as these. Why shame? It took strength. Oh, you say you wouldn't have done it. Too much fight in you. Mark. Their words and laws controlled your world. Bear it or face death. Or worse. There are worse things. death, and the sufferings, I tell you. Some call for our extinction. We bled so you of tomorrow would not have to bleed. Lest they try to write us out their history, we would not die, but survived, so they could not leave us out. Our stripes spared you yours. Are you ashamed of your Jesus who bore the anguish to the cross for your sins? Bearing is an act of love. It was love for our people launched to the future. Our willingness to endure brought you here today. No shame to it, but glory. Now, one more thing I wanted to say is that it occurred to me, one of the things people said about that monument, the figure is that he's naked. Well, he's not really naked. He's wearing like a loincloth. But then I said, wait a minute. I remember going to the National Gallery of Art and seeing the statue of David, who was completely nude. But no one was shocked or insisted that he be draped or removed because he was nude. So people cherry pick their arguments. But if you think about those two things, then there really isn't any shame involved in the way the figure is depicted, because it was showing a condition, not his true self. So that was my poem, and I think it calmed him down enough for it to stand for today.
Thank you. Here in Sarasota, we're very proud of that, a copy of that naked David statue, which is at the Ringling Museum here.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a news story on TV, and there were these children out for a children's outing, and David, totally naked, is standing behind them, and no one thought anything about it.
No. So if people pick their, whatever's opportune for them, whatever suits their purposes, but it's not the same thing at all. Not the same thing at all.
Boy, thank you so much. I'm going to, looking at the time, if I could turn this over to Hayden or Linda to field questions. There are many people on this call, and many of them may have questions more insightful than those I thought of to ask. So I'm going to step back.
Mike and Marcia, before we open it up to everyone, there were a few that came into the chat, okay? This is Linda, and I'd like to at least start with those in the chat, and then we'll kind of remove the spotlights and have anybody who wants to say anything, say anything. But one of the first ones was a curiosity about what actually happened to that statue that was removed in Boston. Does anybody know what happened to the actual statue?
They put it in a museum. I just remember seeing pictures of it being hoisted, but I think it may have gone to a museum.
It did go to a museum, and I read the article, and I don't recall exactly what museum it was, but it was not another public space. It was for for historical viewing, and it was dedicated to a museum.
And then you did mention that you have some books. Would you say the titles of those books again? Because some of us may want to purchase them or come and see them. I think they're behind you, but it would be good to hear the titles. We know we could look up Marcia E. Cole and find these books, but I'd love if you could just tell us the titles again.
Okay, I'll even hold it up. This is my first one, Light in Dark Places, History in Verse. Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, and my second one, this is my author's copy, but Behold the Ball of Light. It won't have this band on it. This is my author's copy. Behold the Ball of Light, History in Verse. And I got that title from an Ezra Pound quote, where he says, holding a book should be like holding a ball of light. And I thought that was a really good, I like that, so I chose that for my title. And I hope it is illuminating. I use the word light in my titles because I used to have a friend who would say that we're living in darkness. And that means not knowing, ignorance. And I hope that my poetry can shed light on topics that people have not approached or are afraid to approach, but that my poetry makes it accessible. And one of the things that I would really appreciate that a friend said to me was that I managed to say a lot with a few words, a few descriptive words. And that's what I want people to appreciate. Each poem has an introduction and also a short brief introduction as to why I wrote the poem or what the historical fact is, as well as the poem. And I hope that you will appreciate them and like them and let me know.
Another comment just about the importance of the fundraising and what happened, and Charlotte Scott being so involved in what she did was placed in the chat too. There wasn't really a question there, but it's the fact that you brought this up and helped us all understand that that first money came from somebody who was enslaved but knew how important it was to tell the story. And everybody wants to thank you for the great poem. And somebody even said, you know, I only live a few blocks from that, but I didn't understand what was going on. And I'm so appreciative of the fact that you've shared as much as you've shared. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and remove the spotlights on the two of you. And everybody's there now. And if somebody wants to ask a question, Jean, if you want to say something, you can raise your hand. And Jean, would you call on them?
I've got one quick comment before we move on, and that's, Charlotte Scott was the spark that started this ball rolling, but all of the money came from people who had been legally property. Obviously Elliot was a great fundraiser. He started Washington University and his fundraising skill was, but all the money came from Black soldiers and freed slaves.
Yes, Marjorie?
Well, I wrote the article and Marcia's got it shown there. And I just want to say a little bit about Charlotte Scott because she's dear to my heart. I live in Lynchburg. I got started on researching about the White family that owned Charlotte. And because I was on the ground, I did spend a lot of time in courthouses and I was able to see a lot of records in which Charlotte's name was mentioned. Then I found out about the statue and immediately took a trip to DC to see it. So my perspective is that for me, at least in Lynchburg, she's kind of a local hero and I lived down the street from where she was enslaved. I also have to say that I continued my research and I think that Jill, who's also listening to this, also did trying to find descendants. I was able to find one descendant who, for whatever reason, was not willing to talk to me. But I would like to say that she was a principal of an elementary school here in Lynchburg. And that Charlotte Scott also had a grandson or a great son, it's not at the top of my head right now, who was the first Black American to be enrolled at West Point. So this woman, in her own very supportive way, raised a family, and through the generations, they continued the work. And I certainly hope that they never take that statue down.
Thank you, Marjorie. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's good to see you, Marcia. We've talked on the phone.
Good to see you too. I have a factoid for you.
Yes.
I got word from the Civil War people in Marietta that they're going to put a marker up for Charlotte near the home of Marietta.
Wonderful.
Next
I have
week,
to work on getting a marker here in Lynchburg.
I'm trying real hard to get one here in DC. But yes, so that sounds wonderful. I hope to be able to join them in Marietta next year.
Yes.
Mike, I have a question for Mike and for Marcia. There are a lot of statutes that have gone up since the United States became the United States. And some statues were to glorify. Some statues were a work of art. Some statues were to intimidate. Some statues were made to keep people in their place. Can you give me a definition or an example of all those statutes and Where are they now?
I that has not been my focus, and I would be, just drawing for straw, pulling for straws to try and address that. I know there are a lot of Confederate statues around, monuments around and whatnot, but my focus has been this particular one and trying to get this one secured for the legacy of Charlotte Scott and all those colored troops and freedmen who contributed towards it. So that is my focus. I'll let others decide the other things.
Mike, do you have
I'm
any
not sure.
comments?
I'm not sure what the question was, Gene, about this different specific statues. I mean, any public art can be political, and historical public art, I think, is almost always, political. Look at the Vietnam Memorial and the different people who took different sides about that. It creates discussion, which is good.
Mhm.
I want to say again that the websites that Marcia talked about are listed in our comment periods. It's the tellourhistory.com, my site, and there was another person who's selling Juneteenth calendars, and there is information about Carl Adams to everybody with a phone number. But I think we have about another 5 minutes. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Let's see.
I have another question then. I think that when we want to memorialize somebody through a statute, there are a lot of things that go into the statute generally that aren't conceived or comprehended by the public. What things do you think they hid in the statute, or what things do you think they didn't publicize in the statute that makes the statute so all-encompassing?
Well, this is another opportunity to invite people to visit the website that my friends and I, including Marjorie, created, emancipationmonument.org. And on there, you will find wonderful videos that tell the history. And we have various speakers and educators who are sharing their talents there. So that's a perfect way to learn more. And I hope that you will take advantage of it. Much more than
I do have a question. This is Linda again. Marcia, you said that you're trying to have some kind of plaque or something put there that people would know they can get more information. Is that going to be like a QR code or something that people can scan? Because I know those have become popular in some places because we're so mobile now with devices. If there was something right there that you could look at this statute, scan it, get to that website, that would be awesome.
Well, that's a good question. I'm looking for a marker like you see around the city. There are various markers at historic spots. Carl Adams, who may not be here now, I don't know, but he was successful in getting one for the first slave freed by Lincoln, and something along those lines with a QR code would be wonderful, because not everyone has a phone that will read a QR code and whatnot, but they can stand there and look at read the marker, compare it to the statue, and if they so choose, also do a QR code.
My son is moving to Washington in January for a job, and I am so looking forward to revisiting the city and looking at this statue with new eyes. Marcia, maybe if I buy you lunch, I can drag you along and we can go to together.
You won't have to drag me. I'll go willingly.
At this time, I think I'd like to thank Mike Whittle and Marcia Cole and Hayden Garbez for a wonderful December program. The next program will be put on by the WBTT and Nicodemus, Kansas, and it's going to give you some background on their play Flying West. And it's going to be put on January 23rd. It's a Monday instead of the normal Thursday, because the actors have a day off on Mondays and not Thursdays. So we moved it to Monday, but it's about Nicodemus, Kansas. It was the all-Black city formed in Kansas by freed persons from Kentucky. And it's a little bit about the story and the historical application, and then the poetic story they're playing in Flying West. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Linda and she can close the Zoom.
Any last words from Marcia or from Mike before we close? Because I would like everybody to unmute for a minute and give them a round of applause for a wonderful Beyond Black
Thank you,
History.
everyone, for being here. Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. It was wonderful.
So appreciate.
Okay.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice day, everyone.
Okay, take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Program. Bye-bye.